Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be talking about the complexity of prayer. Joining me in the studio today is Pastor Sinisha Horvath and Pastor Michael Hamilton. Pastor Sinisha Horvath is a local church pastor, and Pastor Hamilton works on a regional level as one of the directors, helping churches around the Northern Europe getting better in understanding prayer life as one of your remits.
One of them, yes.
One of the many.
Yes.
And that's the one we're looking at today. We're looking at prayer. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were going to explain, Pastor Hamilton, and I'm going to call you Mike during the program.
That's fine, yes.
Mike, if you're going to explain prayer to somebody who's never come across the concept, how would you explain that?
I would say prayer is having a talk with God. Talking as if you're talking to a friend. Sometimes we think that prayer has to have a special formula in order for God to hear us. Do we need a formula for our friends to hear us? When we talk to our friends, we just come from the heart. We just share what's on our hearts. We just talk to them as if they're real, and because they're real. And I think prayer is that same thing. When you're talking to God from your heart, that's what prayer is for me.
What about you, Sinisha? How do you look at prayer?
Well, when we talk about a religion as a whole, I think we could all agree that religion is all about relationship. It's relationship with one another, but also with that is bigger than ourselves. And the prayer is that communication device that builds up that relationship, that makes it grow. So I think it's a medium by which we build and make our relationship with God grow.
Mm-hmm.
But you're both talking about prayer as a relational aspect of communicating with God. Yet when you go to church services in a variety of denominations, you have a very strict liturgy. You have very strict written prayers. Why is that if it is all about a relationship?
I think sometimes people write down prayers. Many of the Psalms that we sing, that we read in the Bible, they're prayers that have been written down, prayers that have been sung. And sometimes people can write down their thoughts towards God. And just reading those thoughts are a blessing to others who hear them. It's like when you hear someone say something and you think, oh, that's interesting. Never thought of it that way. You're helping others to begin to think about God in a particular way. And so really, when you write down a prayer, you're helping others to begin to think about and understand something more about God that they perhaps didn't think about themselves.
I also think, and this is absolutely right, in the way that how we see our God, in our relationships. We have two ways to express our relationship with God. There is this where we call God a friend, mm-hmm. where we want this very close connection, where we have this very personal relationship with God. Jesus is my friend, and this prayer is rather informal. It is like a proper conversation, but there is also, and we should not deny that fact, this also the other need that we come in before the throne, before something that is so great, so unfathomable, that we just want and be there, bow our heads. And this is where we use, I think, more formal way of expressing ourselves when we come before the God of the universe. You just have this feeling of humbleness and submission. And in those moments, I think we use a bit more formal prayers, which is, I think, quite understandable and appropriate.
Yeah. Also, I think we shouldn't allow the written liturgy to prevent us from self-expression, you might say, from talking from the heart. Jesus prayed in a very particular way. And I think we know that because his disciples came to him and asked him, Lord, teach us to pray. There must have been something about the way Jesus prayed that made the disciples want to pray the same way. Because they also said, John the Baptist taught his disciples to pray, so teach us to pray. And so we do learn from one another. When we hear others pray, when we read other prayers, then we learn how to communicate with God more effectively.
And I wonder, that we both have what we've talked about, private prayers, personal prayers, but you're talking also about a more corporate worship form of prayers. and you're bringing back the Lord's Prayer, the one that Jesus taught his disciple as well.
Yes.
And do you find that there is something comforting in a congregation to pray something like the Lord's Prayer that everybody knows, that you can hang all your needs and your feelings to that? Is that something you experience in your ministries?
Worship is something which connects people together. When you have a worship format that everyone can identify with, somehow it gels them. And I think it's the same with reciting the Lord's Prayer together. We call it the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that the Lord taught his disciples. When we all recite that together, or read it together, whichever method we use, it does connect us in our minds. There's a unity that is being created amongst all those who are participating in it. It doesn't detract from the need for private individual prayer, but that corporate act has something about it. It's like when we go to a football match together. All the supporters are going there, we're doing the same thing, we're singing the same songs, we're wearing the same colors, we're supporting the same team. Likewise with the Lord's Prayer, when we're all reciting it together, there's a corporate connection, identity, that really does something to the soul.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly unity, harmony. And also, we help one another. Some of us come different moods, in a church. And when we join together in a prayer, we actually help those who maybe, how many times you have come to church and you really didn't feel well. But then when it starts, with the singing, which is also an act of prayer as well, you suddenly get carried away as well, in a sense, and you are helped by and that sense of harmony, unity actually is this very visible external expression of prayer.
Yes.
And the Lord's Prayer is so beautiful, and it encompasses so many aspects, and I don't want us to spend all our time just looking at that, because that in itself is a whole program, looking at how well that is written or prayed, and how many aspects that actually touches on. And I absolutely agree with you. I think there is a beauty in being able to pray a prayer together. Even when you have different languages praying the same thing, it brings some serenity into the act of prayer.
That's right.
However, often, I feel prayer is expressed as, God, I want you to do this for me. God, can you do this for me? And we talked a little bit before the program started about, Sinisha, you had been listening to a televangelist who were going on about, God, we want you to give us this building, so make sure you get us the money for it. Is there not a danger in prayers becoming like a Christmas wish list that the children will present the parents? God, I want this, 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 and this, and this. And when I've gotten this, I know you're real. So is prayer not, we're talking about it's a communication between friends, but often it becomes a demand from us to God, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think there is usually in us Christians sometimes this harmony slightly with our intellectual understanding of what prayer is, and our emotional as well. On an intellectual level, we understand, and we all agree when we say prayer is really about relationships. When in a proper relationship, when you have a complete trust, then you know that it will be, and you don't need to prove, to it, that are you really going to buy me a bike? If he said it once, you are going to get it. And I think on that level we are fine. But there is something in us, as well, where we want to prove, we like to show, God works in our lives, in our church. So we try to find this evidence. We try to kind of almost force into being these miracles, and I think this is where we kind of get a little bit, disjointed. But it is really, the whole idea would be that it is deeply about that connection with God, out of which all the gifts and the beautiful things come out.
I agree with Sinisha in that he's emphasizing the relational part of prayer. And I think we need to understand that prayer is a relationship. A little child who's just learning to pray, they may ask for things. Now, if a little child comes and asks mom or dad for something, mom or dad wants to give that thing to the child. They ask for something for Christmas. You mentioned Christmas, or Father Christmas and all the things, gift giving at Christmas. If a little child comes to a parent and asks for something, that parent will do everything they can to make sure that child gets it. But as that child grows, they begin to appreciate the fact that they learn how to ask for things. They don't ask for the same things they were asking for as babies. But they've grown in their relationship with their parents. And even if 1 year should come and then they didn't get something from their parents, that child doesn't think that their parents doesn't love them. I think it is the same with God. When we first start out with prayer, in praying to God, learning how to pray to God, we ask for things. And what does God do? He gives us those things. Why does He give us those things? He gives us those things so that we can begin to understand, hey, He is there. He is real. Because He's answered my prayer. Having answered our prayer, the Lord is introducing Himself to us. Hey, I'm your Father. I want to do things for you.
Well, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, because so many Christians, and I know I have prayed for things that haven't come through. So how do I know God is answering my prayer when I'm not getting the answer I'm expecting?
I think that is part of the growth that the Lord wants us to go through. Don't forget, God is real. He's not a theory. He's not an imaginative figure that we see on TV screen. He is real. He feels for us, He understands our needs, and He knows how to communicate with us. He knows what we need at any particular time, whether it be something practical and tangible or something emotional or intellectual. He knows how to communicate with us so that we have a wholesome knowledge or understanding of who He is. And so when we ask for something and we don't get it because God knows that A, it's not good for us, and He will relate to us according to the stage of our growth. If we're at an innocent, naive stage, He's not going to withhold it, and then we're thinking, wondering, where's His gift? Is there really a God? No, He knows that we need to find Him. We need to have evidence for Him in our lives. And so He answers our prayers according to where we are at the time. And so if there's a time when we think that we're not getting what we want, then it's a faith issue.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something about the danger. The problem with this seeking always, watching when the prayer is answered and seeing the miracles all the time, is a problem like when people have with the addiction, You start having something that gives you a kick, but then with time, that's not enough anymore. And you seek more, and then you become blind to things. I mean, when we talk about miracles, you have these extraordinary things happening, when you watch televangelists, somebody sees, things and stuff like that. But I think we need to learn to, through the prayer, through that relationship, to recognize that the miracles are everywhere around us. As I was traveling, we talked about holiday. I was traveling and I stopped at a parking place and admired the Austrian Alps, and I was drinking a bottle of water. And then it suddenly struck me, there was this 1 liter bottle, and if it was filled with a diesel, let's say, that one liter of that stuff was enough to take my big car, the MPV, and 4 passengers, 2 tons of that metal for about 30 kilometers, 25 kilometers, And I was thinking, but that's a miracle. Miracles are everywhere around us. We have a cataract operation today, which is a routine thing. But if somebody performed a cataract operation 300 years ago, it would have been a huge miracle. So I think the prayer is here teaching us to see things rather than to always get things. And if you always want to get things, you will never have enough.
I hear what you're saying about getting things, but I want to challenge you a little bit, because there are times when miracles are not having.
Yes.
I mean, I just lost somebody I studied with and who I worked with to cancer yesterday. And he was prayed for by churches, by people. Sincere prayers were made for healing, and he was working for God in his church. And you can't just say that God always answers in a way that is good for us. Because that is hard to hear when you are losing a loved one. So I'm just going to challenge you a little bit on that. There are times when the miracle is absent, even when we're praying for it.
If I may just step in here, I think the Bible is our guide when it comes to how God relates to people. And as you look throughout Scripture at the miracles that took place, in my experience, the miracles in reading the Scriptures, the miracles did not take place just for miracle's sake. They took place to impress somebody with the reality of God. And in seeing that miracle, their minds were opened up to the fact that God exists. Now, likewise today, I don't think God has changed in his method or in his purpose. Miracles take place to open our minds to the reality of a divine being. Not to just so that we can be all healthy and never dying, because all those whom God performed miracles on have died. The most righteous of people who were led through the Red Sea, those who were raised from the dead, Lazarus, he died. So death is not a sign that God does not exist. If I may give you a little example, my son, when he was younger, this must have been the first prayer that God ever answered for him. He and his mother and his brother were driving, and they were a good distance from home, and the petrol gauge was on red, you know, when it begins to blink. And then his mum didn't have any money on her to get petrol. And my son prayed, said, Lord, please help us to get home. Now, you think that's a very simple prayer for a little child. And he must have been about 5 or 6 at the time. And for some miraculous way, the Lord led them home on that almost empty tank, as it were. Now, for us, it's not a big deal. But for that little boy, he was introduced to a miracle-making God. That was enough for him. He didn't need anything more than the fact that, yes, God brought us home. And when he came, he was so excited, the fact that God answered his prayer. That was God's way of revealing himself, saying, hey, I'm here.
And that is amazing. And I know, all three of us had good answers to prayer in our personal lives. But yet there are times, that many come. And I'll be honest and say there are times in my personal life when I feel I can't even pray. I'm a Christian, I'm, minister, and I feel that, yes, I know it's about a relationship to God, but sometimes in my life, I just can't even pray. And I then get a guilt trip when I go to church. And I hear everybody else has a fantastic, flourishing prayer life.
And this is sometimes where we become a little bit insensitive in a church. You have a testimony time in a church and everybody is saying, I was going to supermarket, there was no way I can park, and suddenly the space opened, and then, and I always get wary of this because I look at the little boy there in the corner who lost his mom to cancer, and I'm sure he prayed. And these are the questions that are real. We try to kind of ignore them, not to see them. And I think this is the question where we come. And I think it's again, all our lives, prayer life is about us accepting the will of God. This is ultimately what we want to be. We want to be reconciled with God in such a way that we can accept His will. And yes, some prayers are not answered. I remember when I was first introduced to a prayer, I'd never been in a church until I was 17. And I heard about this prayer business about if you just pray and if you just wish, God will do it for you. And I remember I was going to a nightclub, still, kind of being here and there, and I saw that girl and I said, oh Lord, if you do this, and so on. I really liked her, Well, a few years ago I went home and I saw her and I said, thank you, Jesus, for not answering me the prayer, But I think that we do sometimes, we request things that are not necessarily for our good. The question that you pose is really we have to come back and start from the relationship and then into everything up to the miracle business.
Yes.
I would put it this way, that prayer prayer wants you to bring in a situation, in a similar one, like when a person learns that he or she has a cancer. Because we live in a cancerous world, you know, in a sinful world. And what usually happens to these people who learn about their cancer, first is shock, then disbelief, denial, anger. But then something happens to these people. There is this acceptance. And what you often have, that these people with these diseases tend to live the last 2 or 3 years of their lives better than all the 60 or whatever years before that. And I think this is where we want to learn from that. We want to come into such a relationship with God where we can really live the life fully, you know, and then we accept and what happens to these people often, actually miracle happens because you stop, you pause, you get a different perspective, somehow solutions start opening, even a cure happens when, we know now that there is a connection between anxiety and depression and with your immune system. And people bring themselves in such a state where wonderful things start happening. And I see prayer like that.
I think also the trust element needs to be brought in, because when someone is helpless and they're totally dependent on others, there's that element of trust that comes in, because you can't do anything. You're depending on the other person to do everything that needs to be done for you. They have to lift you up, they've got to feed you, they've got to clean you after you've messed yourself. That trust is what we need when it comes to God. We've got to realize that we are helpless. God is supreme. And when we come to Him in prayer, we've got to realize that we, as sinful human beings, do not know the end from the beginning, as we say. We don't know, because of our fallen state in sin, what is good and what is bad. We totally trust God for this. And so when we come to Him in prayer, we're saying, Lord, I'm totally trusting you. I'm putting my full confidence in what you can do and you alone, because you know the end from the beginning. You know what is good. You know the right from wrong. I don't. And as we come in with that attitude in prayer, then I believe God accepts us, because we acknowledge Him for who He is. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus begins by saying, when you pray, say, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We begin our prayer by acknowledging that God is more than we are. And then after that, we trust Him to do whatever our needs might dictate.
And sometimes I think that's a very good reminder, because sometimes as Christians we come to God and we're expecting our will to be done. We forget that it is God's will to be done on heaven and earth as well. And I think that actually puts it right in the center of our faith experience as Christians, knowing that prayer is that relational communication, but always being reminded that, God, you have a larger picture of life than I do. Mm-hmm. I just see this. And it is not about my will, but God's will. Mm-hmm. And even when we know that intellectually, prayer can be hard for Christians at times. Mm-hmm. How do we get out of that? And I think I also want to hear, Sinisha, you mentioned a little bit about coming out from an unbelieving state into believing and starting to pray. And how do you actually explain, how did you have prayer explained to you as somebody who didn't grow up with that culture of prayer?
Well, I will make a confession. Even though I'm a pastor, it was only recently that I figured out for myself the idea of intercessory prayer. That's also a good question. You pray for someone.
What is that?
When, basically you have a dear person that smokes, drinks, and you pray for him to stop and he just doesn't pay attention. What's the point then? That was my question. And then I actually realized something. And I said, I'm coming from a secular environment. It has to make sense before we make that leap of faith. If you're born in a church, you are quite happy to make a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. But if you're a secular person, you have to kind of give a first some explanation. It has to make some logical sense. And then, you still need a leap of faith, but you need to bring a person halfway. And I think I can recognize it in my own experience. I realize, there's something wonderful happening in a day-to-day ministry. I often go to people who are completely secular people, never had any connection with religion, never prayed. And you come first time, and I become conscious of that. There is a slight discomfort because there is a priest in the house, and what is he going to do? And I feel the anxiety, and I feel anxious myself a little bit. So I tend not to offer prayer first time. I should. I'm not saying that this is the right approach, but I rather wait for 1 or 2 meetings, and then I ask them before on a 1 or 2nd or a 3rd visit, would you mind if I pray? And there is this, all right, they don't want to upset you or anything, so they do. And there's something wonderful happening almost all the time. When you pray a simple prayer for their well-being, you hear about they seek a job, they struggle a little bit, and you just ask God, you know these people, you know how they feel. And when you pray that simple prayer, almost always you see the eyes watering, you see the tears gathering. What is it? There is this hope when, in intercessory prayer, that someone somewhere will live our individual lives completely alone, and then there is someone who says these words for you. It gives them a hope. It lifts them up from that everyday, mundane. And I think this is that first part of it that you can understand. And when people come to that place, then they are happy to make that further leap of faith in their lives. And this is what worked for me.
And I think that really demonstrates the power that prayer has in a faith journey as well. Because I've never experienced somebody say, no, I don't want you to pray for me. But I've experienced people of no faith saying, well, I also want to pray. And prayer is that crucial part in a relational faith journey with God. And I want to thank you both for coming and discussing a little bit of the complexity around prayer, the miracles, the non-prayer answered, and starting on the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name.
I think it's so crucial, the point that Stanisha made, and you've just highlighted, that prayer is something that is a common denominator for humanity, whether we acknowledge it now or not. If you don't know the Lord, then prayer is what connects you with Him.
Absolutely. And it is that connection that we also from the studio here hope that you are making in your home, wherever you're watching us. And I want to thank you for coming in and being part of our program today. And why not add your voice to the debate by visiting our Facebook group or email us your thought on today's program. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.